Anyway, we're going to utilize these today, and we're going to be stopping and starting. Rebecca is in the back. We have not rehearsed this, so bear with us if we kind of go a little bit too far. Or if you have a question, if you raise your hand, Rebecca will be watching. We'll try to stop the video. But it's been very well done. And I think this will be a tool that will allow boards that are trying to get started to be able to go to the website, access the information, and maybe it will save you a few heartaches that some of us that started early on went through. Perhaps you all won't have to go through, or other boards that come along later with procs. So we'll go ahead and start Module 1, Rebecca.
Welcome to the NASBA Guide to Developing a Peer Review Oversight Committee. This video is part one of a two-part training series to help boards of accountancy with establishing and running the ongoing operations of PROCs, or PROCs as they are often referred. This video focuses on how to initially set up a peer review oversight committee, and the part two video in this series covers the fundamentals for conducting and operating a PROC once it has been established. This training video is made up of three modules: First Steps, PROC Organization, and Recruiting and Selecting PROC Members. Before we get started, it's important to note the table of contents shown on your screen to the left. You can jump from section to section and skip to topics of interest at any time by clicking on the items in the list. There is also an Attachments tab where many important documents are provided for download and use. This tab will be referred to throughout the training. We'll begin with Module 1, First Steps, to learn why development of a PROC at your board is important and what vital procedures must take place in order to properly establish a PROC. Let's get started. The purpose of developing a PROC is to provide reasonable assurance at each board of accountancy that peer reviews are being administered in accordance with the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants standards for performing and reporting on peer reviews. Section 7H3 of the Uniform Accountancy Act, 6th edition, August 2011, addresses the need to implement oversight of peer review programs wherever a peer review requirement has been established by the board. The UAA states that the board shall require, with respect to any organization administering peer review programs, that it be subject to evaluations by the board or its designee, to periodically assess the effectiveness of the peer review program under its charge. Boards designate peer review oversight committees to fill this role. A copy of the UAA is provided under the Attachments tab.
Did you stop, Rebecca? Okay. We are aware that there is one or two boards of accountancy that in their act, they do require that a member of the board sit on the PROC. That is generally not recommended. And the reason it's not, because if that member of the Board of Accountancy is sitting on the PROC and seeing certain information, then that, let's just use a fail for example, firm fails and then they have another peer review and they fail, that board member might be precluded from sitting in and voting in a hearing situation. So that's the reason that it's better. There's also a secondary reason that I feel like boards of accountancy members should not sit on PROCs, and that is, I, as a Board of Accountancy member, have a responsibility, if I become aware of certain things, to notify, the board. So if I see a firm that I think is egregious, and in our state, in Oklahoma primarily, it's 2 consecutive fail or pass with deficiency reports that trigger an automatic referral to enforcement. Well, if I've seen all that information and maybe I became aware that the first fail was really egregious and I vote to send that to enforcement, I am probably precluded from sitting in on the hearing. And if I didn't recommend that it be turned over to enforcement, then have I met my responsibilities as a board member? So I really think that, although we know that there are a couple of states, I know New Jersey, is Bob in here? Did he go? Bob may have gone to the other session. I know that New Jersey, and it seems to me there's one other state that also has board members on it. Jimmy, did you have a question?
What about board staff?
I'm
sorry. What about board staff? Does anybody have an ED or an investigator as a member of a PROC?
Not an investigator. I'm not aware of any state that has their investigator as a member. However, in Oklahoma, what we have done is we want a PROC representative to be present at every RAB meeting. In Oklahoma, we're a small state, so the RABs all meet the same day at the Oklahoma Society's offices in Oklahoma City, and we ask a PROC member, one, to attend each meeting. There are 4 meetings a year. We have 3 PROC members, so they serve a 3-year term. 1 year they're going to have to serve 2 different times. Well, we had a situation arise for the first time. We've had our PROC 9 years that the PROC member became ill and he was unable to attend, so nobody attended that RAB meeting. Report acceptance body meetings. Those are the bodies at each administering entity organization that accept the reports. They either agree with what the peer reviewer has recommended for corrective action, or they may not agree. So they attend those RAB meetings. So what we did is the board made a recommendation in the future, if our staff person becomes aware that a PROC member cannot attend for a multitude of reasons, that individual would attend. And so there's nothing that precludes it other than they have to have signed the confidentiality agreement. Did you have a point, Alan?
I just wanted to let everyone know, too, that when you start talking about the report acceptance bodies, is there is a minimum of 3 on each one of those.
3 individuals.
3 individuals, right. There's at least 3.
That's a requirement
Right.
through the peer review process. So a report acceptance body can be made up of 3 members. In Oklahoma, there are generally 5 members on those report acceptance bodies, but it's done differently in many of the states. Some of the states, Texas, I believe, does a lot of theirs by conference call. Does anyone? We need a mic. Sorry.
Yes, in Mississippi, we do one face-to-face meeting where all the members are there in the PROC, and then the rest of the time it's conference call.
Okay.
And one of the members is on with conference call.
Okay. And you had a comment, Paul?
Janice, are any of these PROCs subject in their state to the open records law? I know in Florida we have a very unique kind of open records law, and the question would be, even in our state, would a designated body of the board be also open records? And then you run into an issue there with if you have a confidentiality requirement in open records.
Well, I can tell you in Oklahoma, we, in our statute, those are protected. They are not subject to open records. They are a protected document. Now, I don't know what each specifically excluded. Now, I don't know all of the states' act and rules, but I would think in many of them they probably are excluded. Now, some states may not permit them to be excluded. And in some states, those reports actually go to the board. So, I mean, it's varying rules,
Janice, I hadn't tried to think all the way through this, but is there...
Could you identify, I know who you are, but do you mind for the group and what state?
Sure. Chuck Talbert from South Carolina. Hadn't thought all the way through this, but is there any reason that serving on the PROC, you should also not be an active peer reviewer?
Well, in Oklahoma, we do not preclude, and in fact, we require that 2 of the members that are on the PROC be what we call team captain qualified. In other words, they are peer reviewers, because we felt that was important for them to understand the process and know what was going on when they attended the RAB meetings. But they do have a responsibility to recuse themselves. That's why we wanted 3 members, so that if one member had performed a peer review, they would not look or make comments at the PROC meeting regarding that peer review that they were a part of. So, Dan, they're coming with the microphone.
Dan Sweetwood, I'm the Executive Director in Nebraska. Janice, when we talk, I'm maybe throwing this back, as we're obviously attempting to create a PROC, but is in Oklahoma, or the PROC, is it considered a standing committee of the board or a subcommittee of the board? I mean, do the regulations allow for the appointment of the members, and how's the administrative makeup of that committee tied to the board? It kind of goes back to Paul's question a little bit about how it's administered through the board.
Our statute does call for the board to approve the members. They are an arm of the board, and they are basically, the way we view it is, you've got the board and you've got the administering entity over here, and there are walls, so to speak, for the confidentiality and all of that. Now, in Oklahoma, our statute says that body can refer to our enforcement committee. So if they see a failed report, let's say, and I'm just going to say there's multitudes of reasons that the firm failed. They don't know how to do a risk assessment. We actually had this case at my last board meeting, which was my last board meeting, but the firm couldn't do a risk assessment, didn't have any procedures in place to do a proper assessment of acceptance. I mean, it wasn't 1 or 2 things. It wasn't like they did a yellow book engagement and failed to do proper testing, and consequently they failed their peer review. I mean, there was a lot of reasons. And let's say that would have been, this wasn't the person's first failed report, but let's say it had been. With it being egregious, they can send that to enforcement. Our enforcement body then, we have a couple of options. We can either, if we just really believe it's egregious and we read the letter, the enforcement committee reads the letter and says, this firm they don't have I mean, you can read the letter and tell they don't know what they're doing. They don't even know how to write a response to what they've done wrong. So that kind of firm, the board would probably take an action and offer what we call administrative consent order, and we might ask that firm we might preclude them from doing audits and ask them to agree to that, which they could do just based on the surface. Now, the firm may say, no, we're not going to do that. Then we would send an investigator out to look at their most current work to see if they had corrected any of those problems. And they might have. Perhaps they've hired another individual that has the expertise to do the audit work in the manner in which it needs to be done. The board would send an investigator, and then we would get a report back, and there might not be any enforcement action in that case, Dan. Is that? I hear you, but if you don't mind.
Has anybody challenged the operation or the setup of the PROC?
No, and that I am aware of, I don't know of any state that it's been challenged in. I'm not aware of any of them. So,
Thank you.
Okay, there are no other comments. Let's go ahead and move on to the next segment.
To initiate the process of forming a PROC, the topic should be added to the board meeting agenda for discussion and an eventual vote of approval by the board. Subsequent research and preparations by the executive director or other board staff may be required by the board before a final board vote takes place. If you are very new to peer review and need background information about the peer review process and how it is important to state boards, be sure to watch the peer review process video created by the ASCPA Vice President of Ethics and Practice Quality, James Brackens, and Chair of the Compliance Assurance Committee, Janice Gray. Check the Attachments tab for a link to the video. Once the board has...
We're just going to show you, this is where the attachments are. This is the video that Jim alluded to in his talk. Many of you, or some of you at least I know, have seen this presentation. Jim and I started a couple of years ago. We've been to around 20 boards. We have 2 more scheduled this year. He shared that he's going to Arizona. I am not going to get to make that trip because I have a previous commitment, and I'm not so disappointed that I had that previous commitment. We're also going to be going to Maine in September. So if your board would like for us to come physically be there and do the presentation to your board so that they have a good understanding, we are happy to do that. However, it is available. So I know, Dan, we came to Nebraska. If you've got new board members, we obviously don't want, we can't keep repeating. Excuse me, this is available, and it's basically the same presentation that we do when we come out and do it physically. But it is an opportunity for you to go back. If someone has a question, maybe it will answer it. So, okay.
Once the board has voted in favor of creating a PROC, legislation and rulemaking are the next steps to support and formalize the board's decision to establish and maintain a PROC. The board may pursue legislation to have details about the peer review oversight program included in their state statutes. Boards should follow each state or territory's appropriate process for introducing a new law. Those that include a clause in the statute for peer review oversight should be careful to keep the language in the proposed legislation broad. Including specific details can limit the scope and nature of the program, which cannot easily be changed. So it is best to simply state the authorization of the board's oversight of the administering entity's peer review program. Let's review an example. The following type of language could be added in reference to the existing rule requiring peer review. Shall require, with respect to peer reviews, that they be subject to oversight by an oversight body established or sanctioned by board rule, which body shall periodically report to the board on the effectiveness of the review program under its charge. Now, we'll move on to rulemaking.
Just go ahead and...
Rules pertaining to the peer review oversight program must be added to the board's regulations. Unlike legislation, the board has more control for making changes to rules, so it is best to include many specific details about the peer review oversight program in the rules, such as the overall characteristics and makeup of the PROC, the purpose and objectives of the PROC, responsibilities of the PROC, minimum deliverables of the PROC, and the schedule for deliverables to the board. If you'd like to see some sample PROC rules currently in use, refer to the Attachments tab for a copy of the Oklahoma Board's rules pertaining to the Peer Review Oversight Committee.
And those are, they put Oklahoma. I didn't ask them to do that. They just picked our rules. I'm not saying our rules are perfect, so please don't take it that way. But this might just be some guidance that would help you. We are going to be tweaking those rules possibly next year. Our board goes through sunset next year. So we're trying to make a decision. In Oklahoma now, all rules must go through the legislature. That was new as of 2 years ago. So we have now, if we're going to change the law or change the rules, it's all got to go through the same process. So the comment there that, boards may have more control over their rules, may be true in some states, but not all states, because we can no longer do that. But we are going to be tweaking those because our rules still have some of the duplicate terminology. The last time we updated them, you still had adverse and modified reports rather than fail and pass with deficiencies. So you will find both sets of verbiage in the rules, and so those need to be cleaned up and tweaked. But that might just give you an example. Texas has a good set, Mississippi, I believe Washington has and I'm giving you states where PROCs have been in existence for a pretty good while. And so they've probably tweaked their rules as they've gone through, and so I would suggest to you not just look at Oklahoma, but you should look at some other states. Also, the UAA obviously has uniform language, and back when we did our rules, that wasn't all in the UAA. It is now. So you should obviously use those. So go ahead now.
For more details about how to organize the structure and program of the PROC, be sure to view Module 2 of this training called PROC Organization, which is the next module in this series. One last thing to mention with regard to creating your laws and rules. This is also a good time to review and consider any confidentiality restrictions in your laws and rules, which may prevent your board from being able to take advantage of the Facilitated State Board Access, or FSBA, offered by the AICPA for electronically reviewing peer review results of firms that have voluntarily disclosed their results. For example, when your peer review laws were added, in an effort to maintain confidentiality, provisions may have been included that would inadvertently prohibit your board from accessing peer review results, even those that were voluntarily disclosed. This should be avoided. To finish up Module 1, we need to cover the importance of establishing an operating agreement between the board and the administering entity for oversight of the peer review program.
Just go ahead.
After legislation and rules have been addressed, an agreement should be executed between the board and the administering entity of that board's peer review program, which is the society in most cases. The agreement should include a basic description of the purpose and structure of the PROC and outline the work to be performed by the PROC. It should also address party liabilities, such as travel expenses required for conducting oversight functions, and detail what each party will be responsible for providing to the other as part of the oversight program. A sample agreement is included for reference under the Attachments tab.
Again, this is just a sample, and you obviously will have to work with the administering entity. As you will note in this, we primarily are talking about the AICPA's program, because currently there used to be a couple of other programs. I know Texas accepted at one time another program, and they stopped accepting their reports because there were problems. And so that I am aware of currently, the only program that is available is the AICPA program. Now, in our rules in Oklahoma, we state we will accept other programs, but they have to meet the same minimum standards that the AICPA program has. When we first established the rules for peer review, it had been in our law for about 10 years. It had been there that the board may require peer review for licensure, but there had never been any rules. And I had served on the peer review board, and when I came off, one of the things that I noted was, as you heard Jim comment, the AICPA can only terminate my membership. That's their stick. If I have gone out and I'm the firm and I've had my peer review done and I've screwed up royally and I got a fail report and I'm assigned all this corrective action and I just say, you know what, this just not, I'm not going to do this. It takes the peer review process with the AICPA takes a couple of years generally, because I have due process. They got to do a hearing. I mean, there's a whole process. Well, when I came on the state board, I'm sitting there going, you know what? These firms are still in my state doing the same crappy work that they were doing when they failed that peer review, and they're not being cooperative. They may not be being cooperative. So I felt it was really important for licensure that the board obviously has a little bigger stick, and it should happen a little quicker. If that firm's not being cooperative, boards of accountancy need to take action. And our action can be, we can limit practice, we can take their license if they just want to continue to not follow professional standards. So that's kind of where we got started in Oklahoma. And then, of course, as this has grown, as you all have seen, most states now have peer review as a requirement for licensure. There's caveats with some of the states. Some states only require it for audits. Some require it for audits and reviews. Some require it for audits, reviews, and compilations. So there are variations of, you know, what's required, but for audit purposes, I think every single state requires the peer review. You have a question?
Carl Williams from Hawaii. So do all pass with deficiency or failed reports require enforcement in Oklahoma?
No, they do not. And there is going to be a session this afternoon. Bob Kegsley, and I'll probably mispronounce his name, Bob Caglione, Cagnazola from New Jersey will be leading that, and we are going to be talking, because that is a fairly, for most states, that's a fairly new area, what to do with failed reports. But we're also going to talk about pass with deficiencies and kind of what the Compliance Assurance Committee believes is the best process.
It would seem to me that we would be encouraging the administering entity to do team captain revisits when they do have deficiencies or fails, to be sure, I mean, as a state board, to be sure that the state board has some assurance that the firm is complying with the recommendations.
Okay. If a firm has a pass with deficiency or a fail report, and Rick, you can help me out with this if I mess it up, I don't know that there would ever not be some sort of follow-up action. Would that be a fair statement?
Probably 95% if they give up their 8-day practice.
Okay, that would be an exception. What Alan said is, that's okay, I'll repeat it. Alan's point is there would be one exception to that, and that is the firm says, you know what? I don't have any business doing this work, and I'm going to agree never to do another audit. Now, what we do in Oklahoma, and I had forgotten that we did this until our last board meeting, we make the firm, when we get that report and they've agreed with the society not to do them, that's no agreement with the Board of Accountancy. So we make them sign an affidavit that must be notarized that says they have agreed to no longer perform audits in the state of Oklahoma. Well, or no longer perform audits, period. So they have to sign that.
I have one more question on a different topic.
That's fine. Let's.
We have a very high percentage of people who are AICPA members who are already complying. And our thinking is that those who now have mandatory peer review are going to be the ones that we, as peer reviewers, we have not wanted to do. Was that the experience in other states who implement a mandatory peer review program where you're kind of getting the bottom of the barrel, so to speak, in the program? And so I would expect there to be a much higher percentage of pass with deficiencies or failures, and we're probably going to be dealing with that. Is that a fair expectation?
I can only speak to Oklahoma, but I will tell you in Oklahoma, when we went to mandatory and those firms that were non-AICPA members, the fail and pass with deficiency rate on those firms, the first go-round was very close to 50%. Very close to 50%. Now, did we have issues with getting peer reviewers to do those? No, we did not. I think peer reviewers, my experience with peer reviewers is that peer reviewers really care about this profession and they want firms to do the right thing. Peer reviewers are not out in the field to try to get a firm. They want the firms to be doing the right things. And I find that most peer reviewers, when they get into a firm that's not doing it right, will even offer help to them. Rick, would you? I mean, I don't know if that's an experience across the board. Rick is the chair of the AICPA Peer Review Board. You might share what.
I tend to think that the nature of the program being education remedial has lent itself to that over the years, and since that's the way that it was introduced to a lot of firms and to all of the people undergoing the peer review, that's really the sentiment that most people have with regard to that. Plus, I think, too, with additional remedial actions and disciplinary actions, those kinds of, well, not disciplinary action, but the remedial actions and team captain follow-ups, the things that you've been mentioning, that tends to lend itself to some additional maybe value added that the peer reviewer can give to the firm in the way of best practices, tricks of the trade, helpful ways of doing things, available resources to them, things that wouldn't necessarily be part of the actual peer review process, but can certainly be the ancillary parts of that.
Right. Okay, Liz, you had a comment?
I just wanted to mention that it is really easy to fail these reports when you're in an engagement review. The failure rate can be really high, but when you start looking at the reason for the failure, you might say, wow, that's really inconsequential considering what I thought a failure may have been for. So you got to be very careful about drawing conclusions about whole scale, oh my gosh, there's this huge failures, when it could be they missed one disclosure in a financial statement that you might consider to be relatively unimportant. So you got to be careful about people sort of overreacting to a failure rate. But our state, Maryland, decided this year to send everybody who had gotten a fail report a letter that said the state board has noticed that you have a fail report and we're paying attention. And that got a whole lot of reaction.
But that's a good thing because you've put that firm on notice, and that's what we do in Oklahoma. You've put that firm on notice. It's not just the Oklahoma society that's observing and following. The Oklahoma Accountancy Board is aware of it, and we are on. We're expecting to see your follow-up completed. Right. So I think that's a great idea. Any other comments to this point? Okay.
Frank Venezia from New York. We just had mandatory peer review effective January 1st, 2012, and I can give you a little bit of background. The first round of firms that have never had peer review, there are a lot of fails. But it hasn't been a problem finding peer reviewers to do that work. Peer reviewers are looking at that work as good work and coming to firms with, again, as you state, improvements in their practices and so on and so forth. One of the things that we are finding, though, is that a lot of firms are choosing to go out of the A&A practice. There have been a slew of letters coming in that basically say, look, I do one or two of these engagements and I'm just not going to do this anymore because the cost and the oversight and everything else is somewhat restrictive.
Well, and that's a business decision the firm has to make. We're not trying to push people out of the accounting and auditing services business. We're just saying, as regulators, if you're going to be in the business, you have to follow standards, period. And that's no different, I don't think, than what the program is designed. You know, we're not trying to push people out the door, but by the same token, if you're not going to follow professional standards, don't do work in our state. Alan?
Well, I was just going to say in Kentucky that we had this mandatory peer review happen several years ago, and actually I was chair of the committee at that time. And yes, the failure rate, or at that time it was modified and adverse, was higher. We did not have trouble finding peer reviewers to do the work. One thing to remember on these folks that are doing 1 and 2 engagements that Janice was talking about, and they're saying they're getting out, Department of Labor has already proven with regard to their statistics that the firms that are doing 1 or 2 EBP audits tend to be the ones that have the highest failure rates and probably should not be doing those audits. Now, it is a business decision for the firm to make on where they're going to get out of the A&A practice. But what we want is if they're going to stay in, do it right, where they're doing 1 or where they're doing 200.
That's right. Follow the professional standards. Let's go ahead and finish this one if we could.
Let's review what we've learned about the first steps for developing a PROC. In this module, we covered why it is important for every board to have a PROC, getting peer review oversight added to your board's agenda, including legislation and rules for supporting a PROC, and how to establish an operating agreement between your board and the administering entity. You can always reach out to NASBA staff and members of the Compliance Assurance Committee for guidance with your questions about setting up a PROC at your board. A list of contact names and contact information is available for you under the Attachments tab. The next module in this series delves into the details of organizing a PROC. You can click here to start the next module or jump ahead to Module 3 about recruiting and selecting PROC members. This concludes Module 1.
If we could skip the review of Module 1 that's in Module 2, I think there's a review.
Welcome to the NASBA Guide to Developing a Peer Review Oversight Committee, Module 2, PROC Organization. In Module 1, we covered the basic first steps for establishing a peer review.
We're going to skip that, and I'm going to give you all the link to this afternoon.
It is important to first consider what the responsibilities of your PROC will be and what specific activities the members will engage in for meeting those responsibilities. Establishing these expectations up front can help drive subsequent decisions, such as how many PROC members you will need. All of these sorts of details can be included in your rules. Examples of the different types of roles and responsibilities of the PROC are ensuring administering entities are administering peer reviews in accordance with the standards adopted by the State Board and the AICPA, requiring at least 1 PROC member attend each of the administering entities' review acceptance body meetings, and issuing a PROC report to the State Board annually. These are just a few, so be sure to check the full list of suggested considerations for PROC roles and responsibilities included in the Attachment tab. After you have decided on the activities and responsibilities of the PROC, it is now time to consider the size and makeup of your PROC. The size of your state may be something to consider when deciding on the number of PROC members required. Larger states may need more PROC members to attend the RAB meetings across the state. How often the RAB meets may also affect the number of PROC members needed. States that have more frequent RAB meetings will most likely need a larger number of PROC members. Just make sure you have enough capacity with your PROC to be effective in accomplishing the responsibilities you have outlined for your oversight program. There are some important points to consider when establishing what types of PROC members the board will allow. Let's review the suggested guidelines, some of which are derived from the AICPA's Peer Review Oversight Handbook. A copy of that handbook is included in the Attachment tab for convenience. The goal is to set parameters that help ensure a qualified and objective PROC, such as the PROC should be made up of at least 2 CPA members and may include at least 1 public member. PROC members should not be a current board member if the board sees the peer review reports, and should not be a current member of an ethics committee or peer review committee of a board or the AICPA. PROC member seats may be held by active or retired CPAs, and at least 1 member is advised for each section or region of the jurisdiction. You may even want to consider a method for choosing members, such as a requirement that the board must vote on approval for each PROC member. Next, we'll focus on what criteria PROC members should meet in order to participate in the program.
Okay. We have question or comment here.
Janice, is a suggestion for PROC members to meet with every RAB, because in Florida our RABs are meeting every 3 weeks, if not every 2 weeks. That's throughout the whole year. That's quite a bit. But the process really doesn't change. I mean, can they meet like on RAB meetings maybe every other time or whatever? Because the process is not any different from one RAB meeting to another. So if they're really overseeing the process, and that doesn't change, you know, do they have to, or should they meet every single time a RAB meets?
Well, I think the question I would want to ask is, when the RAB meets, is it the same RAB each time? In other words,
No, they're different RABs.
okay, well, see, if they're different RABs, then you've got different interaction with different individuals.
But those RABs may meet 2 to 3 times a year, so you could space out years to agree with that particular RAB meeting.
Oh, okay, so that RAB is the same RAB.
Right. Well, we got 5 different RABs.
Right.
So they'll
But
meet at least 2 to 3 times during a year.
But those 5
as a
RABs
RAB.
have the same
same
committee
members each,
members.
yes.
Then I would say yes. I thought you meant the RAB members rotated. So if it's the same members, I would say that's dependent upon your state. As I shared with you in Oklahoma, they meet 4 times a year and they all meet on the same day. So it makes it very nice for our PROC. They go to, one person goes to each meeting and they rotate between the 3 RABs. So yeah, and so conference call, it's a little bit different. So I would just say whatever your board is comfortable with and will feel like they're getting a good cross-section review of the RABs. Other committee members, do you have any comments, Alan? Isn't that kind of what you would? So what I did want to point out, just a couple of things so you get a feel. States who already have RABs that have 1 to 4 members, there are 13 of those. Those that have 5 to 7 members, there are 9. Those are larger states. California, Texas, Maryland has 5 to 7. No? You're in the 1 to 4. Okay. Whoever answered the PROC survey said 5 to 7, so may have inadvertently clicked the button. New York has more than 5. Okay, how many do you all have?
We have 7 RABs.
Do you have 7 members to your PROC?
Oh, I'm sorry. We have 5.
5 members in New York. So, and 1 public member. So a total of 6 in New York. So differentiation, you just have to look at it. The reason we feel like there really needs to be 3 is to get the opportunity. If you have someone that has to defer, you've still got 2 individuals. You don't just have 1 person sitting there making all of the decisions. Over here first.
Just to clarify, so the PROC member sitting in the RAB is observing only and is not participating in any form or fashion. Is that correct?
That is the intent of the PROC, that you are there to observe. I do know in Texas, they do make comments. I think in Oklahoma, I could fairly say if one of our PROC members was sitting in a RAB and they really thought the RAB was wrong in their decision, they might say, have you considered this? They would not say, I think you're wrong and you need to change your mind. But I think they might say, well, but did you think about this being an A133 and that is a little higher scrutiny? And it is, Department of Labor, A133 single audits. Those are high risk areas. So I would say that the majority of them, I believe, are observation only. And that is the purpose of the PROC. The PROC is there to observe the process and report to the Board of Accountancy that the process is functioning and working like it's supposed to. RAB members are free to discuss their own issues. There's not, you know, sometimes you can have a situation where, and we had this in Oklahoma. I was a RAB chair for about 10 years. And we had an individual, and we rotated every year, so you didn't have exactly the same team I didn't have the same team the whole 10 years, but I had different team members. And we had one individual that served on the RABs in Oklahoma, and he's a super guy, very smart. But he was an individual that would sometimes take a position over here that says, this firm these are good guys. They've been practicing a long time. They just messed up on this one little thing. We shouldn't, you know, I mean, they didn't do any testing on single audit, but, you know, we ought to just, and then the next time on a review, and it might be somebody, man, he was ready to hang him. We need to do, you know, they need to quit doing audits. I mean, so there was no consistency. Those are the kind of things that we want PROC members to be looking at. Are the RABs consistent in their decision process? Because as Jim mentioned to you earlier, we want to know that a peer review that is done in Oklahoma, if it had been done in New Jersey or California or wherever, that the end result would be very similar. In other words, that we're not getting across the country that peer reviews are being handled differently. So consistency is important. We want to know that no one is, on a RAB, one of the things that we look for in Oklahoma is that everyone is given an opportunity to express their opinion, particularly if it's a discussion that's a little bit controversial on peer reviews. And I've sat in those RABs. Sometimes it's tough decisions. They're not always just slam dunk. I know a lot of people think that it's just a pat on the back, good old boy deal. And believe me, when it's a firm with an issue, there is a lot of discussion. I don't believe RABs take their decisions lightly. They think about what corrective action is going to really help this firm. Is it CPE? Do they need to just go get some education because maybe they're a tax practitioner and they haven't had a course in accounting or financial preparation in 10 years, but they're doing, I'll just use compilations. They're doing compilations. They don't have a clue. I mean, there's just a lot of variety. So I think they really take into consideration what is this firm need that's going to get it past these hurdles so that they can pass their peer review and follow professional standards. So any other questions or comments? We'll try to finish up. We're really past time and I'm into your break. So if we'll just roll it all the way through.
Many of the
Rebecca.
same types of qualifiers outlined in the AICPA's Peer Review Program Manual are suggested for members of peer review oversight committees. For example, your board might require that PROC members have peer reviewer experience, that they must be active in public accounting at the supervisory level or above, or be at a supervisory level while serving in an audit function of a state or local government. And where applicable, that the member or member's firm must be enrolled in a board-approved sponsoring organization's peer review program, and that the result of that firm's most recent peer review must result in a pass report. Your board might also require PROC members have a clean licensee disciplinary record. The Accountancy Licensee Database, or the ALD, can be used to check the history of potential members. These are just some of the options to be considered, but the key takeaway is that boards do not need to create all of these requirements from scratch. There are many good resources to turn to as basis from which to build their own rules, including the AICPA standards for performing and reporting on peer reviews, as well as other state boards' existing rules on peer review oversight. A copy of the Oklahoma Board's current PROC rules is provided under the Attachments tab. Just like any typical committee structure, term limits for members should also be addressed. Should PROC members serve only 1 year, 2 years, or maybe a maximum of 3 years? One thing to consider is that it is good to always have members on the PROC with some experience, so they can help train and work with incoming members. Having one-year limits would make that a challenge. Some states also choose to limit the number of terms one can serve, so there may be some benefit in adding that constraint as well. How about compensation for PROC members? PROC members can be paid for their work on the committee or be on a volunteer basis. Each board will vary as to what they may offer. If your board is able to offer compensation, you should consider the number of hours that will be expected per year and set an hourly pay rate, not to exceed a certain dollar amount or number of hours per assignment. Your board may also consider whether travel expenses can be reimbursed to PROC members when they travel to attend peer review committee and review acceptance body meetings, also referred to as PRC and RAB meetings. All of these are things to consider for your board's PROC. Let's
Wait,
review what we
stop.
learned about PROC organization. In this
Okay, I'm not going to go through that review because it is just the review of everything we've covered. Just to give you a little bit of flavor, when we did our survey, 14 boards responded that their PROC worked less than 25 hours in a year, over the full year. I think in Oklahoma it's probably less than 15. It's, about what they end up with. 7 states, 25 to 50 hours. Texas, I'll pick on them, 50 to 100 hours. But remember that Texas has a lot of registrants. I was looking to see, California was in the 25 to 50 hours, but they do have 7 members. And I don't think, Texas has 3? 3. So that's a lot of difference. So it might be dependent upon how many PROC members you have also. 15 states have unlimited terms. That gives you any kind of feel. There are no terms. 3 had they can serve 3 consecutive terms in Oregon and 2 consecutive terms in Mississippi and New York. So that kind of gives you an idea. I don't know if our survey is online. I don't see Leona in here. Rebecca, do you know if the survey is on our website yet? The results? I don't think it is. We'll get these results out there because I think that would be also helpful for you all that are getting started to look, and it's by state, how they responded. And remember that some of the answers we don't know absolutely, we don't do anything to verify the information. This was just a survey that we sent out about 8-9 months ago. So we'll make that available. PROC PROCs are, in my opinion, and I'll cover this a little bit this afternoon, but I just really think that we're talking a little bit about firm mobility now. And I think in order for states to really feel comfortable with firm mobility, we're going to have to know that those states that have peer review, that they know that their state is functioning in the same way mine. Jimmy and I, Arkansas does not currently have an active PROC. They're getting started. Oklahoma does. So I want to know that Jimmy and them are doing the similar type things that Oklahoma is, and that they're satisfied that their registrants are getting an appropriate process. And so I think this is something that's going to get a little more heated up. We know that there are some states that have some real budget constraints. We're going to be working on trying to help with some of that. We don't know exactly how we're going to go about it, but we spent a good deal of our time in our committee meeting yesterday talking about some ways that NASBA might be able to offer some assistance. So any other questions that I can answer if you're just getting started and you have a question? Okay, can we have a microphone? And I'm really cutting into your break, and I apologize.
One quick one, Janice. Are the states that don't have PROCs, don't have PROCs, that have the statute involved, are they mostly relying on the AICPA oversight results? Because the AICPA is doing this, they're just not doing it on a per meeting basis, but they do have oversight every other year. The individual states deciding administrator also does oversight every other year. Those reports are usually published. Is that something that the state board can rely on without having, if they choose not to set up their own PROC for some reason?
Well, if you will recall Alan's comments at the very beginning of our summit today, it's called trust and verify. Do we trust what the AICPA is doing and that they're doing the appropriate steps? Yes. But as a board member, do I have a responsibility as a board member to verify that? So I still think that we have responsibilities as board members to know. I also think the report piece of it from your PROC to your board, written report annually to say, you know, we've observed, we've done whatever you've charged with your PROC with doing, that they report back to you that they have done those performance measures and that they agree that the program is working. That's some assurance to me was assurance to me as a board member that, you know, I mean, we cannot stop firms that choose to lie. We had this discussion yesterday. A firm that chooses to lie to their peer reviewer, to the administering entity, there's nothing we can do about those types of firms other than when the 911 call comes, we can certainly take action. But I just think we have a responsibility to ensure that things are being followed. Yes?
That's all good, except it only applies to members.
That is correct.
So you're going to miss, you know, the ones you want to catch are the ones that are not members and they've chosen not to be members to avoid peer review. So what he was saying, you know, it works for membership, but it's the non-members that are the ones you really want to be seeing.
Because what the AICPA is doing, thank you for pointing that out, and I should have mentioned that. What the AICPA is looking at when they go into the state societies that are administering their program is only AICPA members. They're not sampling any, what we call them affectionately non-nons. They're non-AICPA members, non-state society members, so you can have nons and you can have non-nons and you can get into a lot. But you're exactly right. So if you don't have a PROC operating, those firms are never getting any oversight. Thank you for, very good point, very good point. I'm gonna let you go. I've taken way too much of your time in your break, and I'm going to ask Art and them to start about 5 minutes after 11, so you still give you at least 10 minutes. And I'm available, so are other members of the committee, and we will do our best to answer any questions. My information, I don't know if they have my contact information, but I will be happy to give my contact information to any of you that want it, and anything that we can do to help. This series is going to be continued. We intend there will be at least one more module in this series. And then is there a second series that will have 2 modules? So hopefully those modules you'll be able to go back and look at if we went through information too fast today. Thank you.